Hello, this is Dr. Harriet Fraad. I am bringing you Capitalism Hits Home. This is a show about the intersections of personal life and emotional life with capitalism, with the machinations of our economy, our society, our culture, and trying to show you how everything, including personal life, is shaped by all of these forces, as well as personal life shapes all these forces as well. I want to thank Democracy at Work for making this podcast possible. And I want to particularly thank our Patreon supporters that make it all possible. We need you. If you give us $1 a month, we're happy. If you give us $1 million, we're also happy. And I also want to thank everyone who's listening and watching. You're all very important in this whole project we have of understanding what's going on and changing it to make it better for all of us. Because labor is absolutely of crucial importance. I want to talk about labor. All of our lives begin with a woman in labor. And then women do the invisible labor, unpaid and unsubsidized, of bringing us up, giving birth to us, taking care of us, taking care of the environment in which we live, feeding us, and managing our complicated lives. And that labor, like so much labor, is devalued to the point where we don't even know yet what are the skills you learn from taking care of vulnerable life. What are the skills you learn through making order and cleanliness? What does it give to the world to nurture people through food, preparing food, buying food, raising food, setting food in front of us? All of these things are not even explored because they've been the traditional work of women, all except raising the food, have been the traditional uncelebrated work of women, which of course needs to be celebrated, as all labor does. We don't really learn about labor. I went through PS 9, Public School 9 in New York City, and then Public School 81 in the Bronx. We never learned about labor. In fact, in the late 50s, after the McCarthy onslaught and the House Un-American Activities Committee, Labor Day was referred to as Arbor Day, where you planted a tree. And in the history books I read in PS 81, which I had to read, all about the boring pilgrims every year, we never read about labor. And yet everything you see is the result of someone's labor. You look at the home you're in. Somebody built that home, and somebody raised the lumber and cut the lumber and planed the lumber and treated the lumber to make it part of that home. And somebody put up the wallboard. Somebody painted that. Everything we look at is the result of human labor. You walk out onto the street, paved by human labor, as well as the asphalt is made by human labor. You look at the grass, somebody planted that grass, unless you're in the wilderness. It's created through someone's labor. And yet, labor as such is not really celebrated in the United States. We have Labor Day, but that's when people have a picnic. But not when people celebrate that it's other people's work that makes this world go round. And it's work that makes America. And it's the workers that built this place, not the lofty capitalists who we extol because they're rich and famous, but the people who did the work, who need to be valued. And those rare places where labor history is actually taught, which it sure wasn't taught to me. And I went to public school, and then I went to a private high school. Labor history wasn't taught. And then I went through college and graduate school. I never had a labor history course. And where it is taught, because I've looked at some of the books, it's taught rather strangely from the very beginning. when Columbus supposedly discovered a land that people had discovered long ago and that were living in, the indigenous Americans. From that point, the pilgrims who came here were not what we were told. They were not principled people searching for religious liberty. Between 1/3 and 2/3 of the people who came to the American colonies were indentured servants. What is an indentured servant? An indentured servant is somebody who has to serve a master for between 1 and 7 years. In the colonies, it was usually 7, in exchange for their passage to the United States. A lot of these indentured servants, in fact, at least 1 out of every 10, was given the alternative of going to the colonies or going to jail. Women could be sent over to do indenture as wives, which they had to live with some guy and have sex with him and clean for him and cook for him and bear his children for 7 years in exchange for their passage and not going to jail. And the crimes for which they were committed were things like, for women, lewd carriage, means walking around looking too sexy, or being out after 10 p.m. And both men and women started being arrested for the drop of a hat because they wanted to populate their colonies. The Spanish did the same thing for their colonies, mainly in Latin America. People were arrested for doing almost nothing in order to get them to be sent over to labor in the colonies. And so, after 7 years, you would be awarded freedom and sometimes, a bunch of tobacco, a bunch of corn, and an outfit or two. And that was it. And so that was the way our colonies, America, as we know it, white America, was populated. Now, we really didn't hear that between 1/3 and 2/3 of the people who came here had very little choice and who came here and basically worked like a slave for a master for the period of time that they were indentured. If an indentured servant ran away and were caught, they had to serve even longer, and they were often beaten as well as, of course, being returned to their master. Howard Fast, famous writer who was a committed communist for a long time till he gave names of other communists, but he wrote a wonderful book about colonial America called Patrick Henry and the Frigate's Keel. And one story that's particularly beautiful in that collection is a story of Rachel, an indentured servant who came here as an indentured wife, working for 7 years for a man, bearing his children, raising his children, doing his household labor, and being his emotional outlet as an indentured servant. And Britain, I should just have a little aside here. Once we had our revolution and Britain wasn't interested in replenishing its colony, which was no longer a colony, but an independent nation, Britain did the same thing in Australia, arresting people for nothing and sending them to Australia as an alternative to prison. And they did that because they really needed labor. They needed women to reproduce citizens for the colonies, as well as to do hard labor, which they did often. And they needed men to do the same. Later, after the American Revolution, England no longer had the need to populate its colonies, and slaves started to be brought in. Another interesting aside is that indentured servants were sometimes black. But after the rebellion together of black and white indentured servants, just at about the time of the American Revolution, they decided blacks had to be slaves. They could no longer ever be freed. So Slaves took the places of indentured labor, particularly in the South, where they did everything. They built the South. And that's another thing that is now contested, where people don't want to teach slavery. They call it, the right wing calls that black immigration, going to a better place than Africa, even though people were terribly treated and made to work long hours and put up in inferior housing and liable to be beaten and raped by their masters. One of the reasons that Black people in America are not as dark as their African counterparts is because so many of the women were raped. So there were a lot of mixed race children. After the Civil War in the the Civil War was 1860, it was over. Immigrants started replacing slaves in the North and South, but particularly in the North. 15 million immigrants from Europe came here in between the late 18 and the early 1900s, so until 1915. 15 million of them. And they were told in Europe that the streets were paved with gold and opportunities were endless, and then came here and worked in dangerous factories, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. My own great-grandmother was one of those people who came over at that time. And she came because when she was 15, she was married to the rabbi of her village in Hungary. He was 70, and her parents were happy to marry her off because he was rich. By the time she was 19, she had 2 children, and he died. And so that at 74, he died, and she was left with 2 children. His children from his previous marriage came and took a lot, but she was left with enough money for passage to the United States, which she was glad to take, because if she had stayed in Hungary at 19, she would have had to wear black and be a widow in mourning for the rest of her life and never allowed to work or remarry. So she came here and worked in factories and saved enough money for the passage of her 2 little girls who came over here under the care of a friend who was also emigrating to the United States. Of course, they didn't have any daycare, so people who had children put them in orphanages for the day, and these were horribly punitive institutions where if you peed in your pants the way these frightened little girls did sometimes, they'd put your underpants over your face and make you stand in the corner for the day. And they were physically hurt. Workers then, immigrant workers, worked 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. In 1911, a huge event happened. That was the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, where in that shirtwaist factory, there were hundreds of women, mainly immigrant women who were Italians or Jews from Europe, working to make shirtwaists, elegant shirts with a high collar and buttons and puffy sleeves for the wealthy women who could afford them. They had 10-hour days, 6 days a week. The doors were shut lest they go out and take a breath of fresh air. The fire escapes were allowed to deteriorate so that they were of no use. And out of the 4 elevators available in the building, only 1 operated. If you came late, you were docked a day's pay. And in 1911, the lint that flew everywhere because there were no air standards caught fire, and 147 women died. They mainly jumped off out of the windows because the fire escapes were shoddy, because the elevators weren't working, because the doors were all locked to keep them in there. And that became a labor tragedy. In 1909, there was a huge strike of men and women who worked in the needle trades, and some factories complied with the requested standards, but not the Triangle Shirtwaist factory, where 147 people died, and the owners got off without legal consequences. However, it sent a shock through the nation about the situation of labor. And one of the people who witnessed this fire when she was a little girl was Frances Perkins, who became the Secretary of Labor under FDR. She heard the bells clanging from where she lived and went to see what was wrong and saw 147 women jumping through the flames to their deaths on the sidewalk. And she vowed that she was never going to let that kind of thing happen again in her life. And she was a very determined little girl and ended up being the labor secretary under FDR, who was an avowed and proud socialist and who was instrumental in the 1938 child labor laws that prevent children, because children were, of course, jumping to their deaths as well, since they were working as well. And daycare wasn't existing. So women sometimes drugged their kids and took the babies in a basket so they'd stay quiet and brought their little kids to be there. And then older kids, starting at about 10, worked the 10-hour days, 6 hours a week. So it was a slaughter of mainly women and children, and some men too died. The overseers tended to be men. The fabric cutter tailors tended to be men. So 171 people died altogether, but it was 147 of the women workers, which burned itself into consciousness of the people who were sensitive. After that, there were some reforms made, although children were allowed to work, and the kind of inspections and enforcement of labor laws didn't really happen until 1938, when FDR was elected. And when FDR taxed the wealthy capitalists at 96.8%, and when the huge marches in the streets, marches of the unemployed demanding jobs, and when the huge demonstrations happened, and when the rural farmers hung judges who condemned family farms, and the place was teeming with labor rebellion, FDR could say to his rich compatriots, because he was from a rich family too, look, if you don't give in to this demand for a 96.8% tax on you, they're going to take your factory. They're going to take your mill, and you won't have anything. And so they agreed. And as a little aside, that was a 96.8% tax rate on their production. Now people like Trump pay no taxes. And somebody like Romney can run bragging, I do pay taxes, 13%. And where people can put their tax money offshore, and so they're not taxed on it. Now we're in a different capitalist robber baron era, where Bezos, the richest man in the world, got a refund on his taxes. But FDR levied a 96.8% tax, which he used to better these people's condition and the condition of all the other people who built America, the 20,000 Chinese who came here until the Chinese Exclusion Act wouldn't let them settle here or continue here. They came to build the transcontinental railroads across the United States in the West because white people wouldn't take those jobs in those conditions, working in all sorts of weather for 10 or 12 hours a day at little pay. The Irish built the subways in New York, and white immigrants built the trains in the East. But the transcontinental railways were built by horribly oppressed Chinese immigrants. Those Chinese immigrants were paid a fraction of what white workers got. So we don't learn about any of these things in school. I didn't know about the Chinese Exclusion Act and how Chinese settlements were burned in the West when some of those railroad workers became successful fishermen and their villages were burned. And now we have a different problem. Now capitalists have bought our government. And so they're allowed to get away with putting their tax money offshore and having well-paid corporate tax lawyers work their way out of a minimal contribution. However, in the pandemic, something interesting happened. People became more aware of labor with the term essential workers, and for a while they were given hazard pay. However, capitalism and its outrageous profiteering at the top continued. This is a wonderful book, Stuck Nation, by Robert Hennelly, and it's available through Democracy at Work or online. You can find it. And I want to read to you a little bit from Stuck Nation, which tells us how the capitalists managed to take care of themselves while so many essential workers died. More than a year into the pandemic, researchers with the Institute for Policy Studies documented that half the nation's 100 largest low-wage employers had rigged their own CEO compensation rules to give the CEOs on average a 29% raise, while frontline workers got a 2% decrease. The Institute for Policy Studies reported that in this cohort of CEOs, compensation averaged $15.3 million, while the median pay for their workforce was between $7.25 an hour and $15 an hour, and less than $30,000 a year. But America, because we celebrated essential workers in name, and those essential workers were the people who actually served us food, the people who transported and delivered the food to our homes, the people who were there on the front lines delivering our needs, meeting our needs, were celebrated. There was a ticker tape parade in New York for essential workers, but not the raises that people needed, not the mandatory at least $15 an hour, not the protective equipment that would have protected those workers. And that includes the essential workers in the hospital. Because if the custodian of the hospital, if the janitor leaves the place filthy, people will get infections. If the nurses' aides aren't there to help the patients won't survive. It isn't just the surgeon who makes wild amounts of money while the janitor gets minimum wage. But all the other personnel in the hospital, including the nurses, who suffered terribly from COVID, got sick, and often had insufficient protective equipment. But that plight of the essential workers sparked labor activities, so that all around the United States now, there are labor unions that are forming. Mostly we don't hear about them. It was cued in the Daily News and also in the New York Times, where their workers organized. They had about an obituary-sized paragraph announcing that. Whereas they have ads of a whole page for capitalist profiteering. So a man named Mike Elk started his own website, which anybody can get on. It's paydayreport.com, Payday report.com, where anyone can hear about all the strikes that are going on in the United States, which are so numerous. And when the Bessemer, Alabama attempt to create a union at Amazon failed because of an enormous investment in a company that specializes in preventing strikes, all sorts of other organizations started, including an organization called the Amazonians, who are not trying to start a union right now, but they're trying to intervene in every labor dispute to make sure that labor needs are represented and publicized to the point where they've gotten many gains. People used to get 50 cents an hour when their hours changed, and of course their sleep cycles were terribly interrupted. When swing shifts were happening and they had to adjust, they got 50 cents an hour more. But after the Amazonians organized, they got $1.50 more an hour. And so that organization started. Residential assistants who live in college dorms, as well as teachers' assistants and lab assistants, are organized in the universities. The Deliveros Unidos, the food delivery people, who are mainly immigrants, organized into Deliveros Unidos, United Deliverers. And through their organization, they changed their lot. They managed to be paid more. They demanded and got the right to go to the bathroom at the restaurants whose food they took before they struck. They didn't even have a chance to go to the bathroom at the restaurants who they were serving. And they got their whole tips. The companies would take part of their tips. And these were America's poorest immigrant workers who organized. Because if labor has a chance, and I believe we do have a chance now, I believe the people who do the work have a chance to share the proceeds of their labor rather than give it to the top and be immiserated when they try to start a union because the boss has the money to put it down. We have to remember that America is a class society. And there are two classes here. The employers, who make money off their employees' work, and the employees, who create more wealth for their employer than they ever get in their paycheck. It doesn't pay for a capitalist to ever hire anybody if they're not making more from their labor than they're giving that person. And that includes people who aren't actively involved in producing something, like secretaries, whose work is essential to the profit, so they get a little share of the profit, most of which goes to the top. And the CEOs, as we illustrated, give themselves healthy raises all the time, even when they've absolutely done a terrible job. They get golden parachutes where they leave with millions of dollars in pension funds while their workers get no pension. But that's the employer-employee class divide. And that's so even for people like teachers who work for the government. Capitalists need people who know how to read and write in their factories. And so there's a whole sector of workers who work to make things possible in our capitalist system. But more and more people are realizing, wait a minute, our work is important. That's what is essential. It's not essential to clip coupons from stocks. It's not essential to buy and sell on the stock market or have a hedge fund. It's essential to eat. It's essential to have a home. It's essential to be safe. It's essential to be protected by fire, from fire. And flooding, as we all know, as we watch the floods, and poor people's basements in New York flooded, causing 13 people to die. But these are essential workers who do the basic work we all need. And we're catching on in America that we are essential, we who do the work of this society, and we need to be treated better. We need better salaries. We need medical care for all. We need better protection. We need laws that don't jail us if we don't have the money to pay a fine. We're not in some abusive prison. We need to be taken care of, like we were in the New Deal, where in the midst of a terrible depression, thanks to FDR taxing the rich at 96.8%, we got Social Security for older people. We got unemployment insurance for the unemployed. We had the end to child labor. We had every benefit that we count on. We got the 8-hour day, which was fought for by unions before, and of course is being taken away now that unions have become less militant. Once they kicked out the communists and the socialists and the firebrands who had created union militancy, the unions have gone down, but they're coming up again. It used to be that 35% of American workers were unionized, raising all workers' wages. Now it's about 9%. And that's because the people who created the New Deal, the people who made the demonstrations and made the family farms judges be hanged or stop condemning family farms, all those people were big labor organizations like the CIO. They were farmers' organizations, working farmers, small farmers. They were factory workers. They were the workers who built the society, and they demanded jobs, and they were angry, and they were threatening. And so FDR could tax the millionaires and billionaires and give us the benefits that we have. And by the way, those can all be taken away. Trump tried to make the flight attendants, and succeeded, and the baggage handlers and the air traffic controllers all work for no pay. But even though Reagan had destroyed their union, a bunch of air traffic controllers decided to have a sick out, and everything was chaos. They did it in New York. No flights could be handled. They couldn't fly out. They couldn't come in. Across the country, things were stopped up, and Trump stopped that policy because we have the power. We are the essential workers, and we can change America to be a fair and honest place, a socialist place where workers are honored and recognized. Thank you. Thank you all for listening and watching, and thanks especially to our Patreon subscribers who help to sustain us. Goodbye. See you next time. It's Dr. Fraad.